There are moments in Genoa City when the past does not return like a memory. It returns like a debt, patient and merciless, waiting for the exact second when a family has grown comfortable enough to believe its old wounds have finally closed. That was the atmosphere surrounding Lily when the report first landed in her hands, quiet on the surface, almost insultingly ordinary in appearance. Just another document among the countless pieces of paper that pass through the lives of powerful families who spend years managing appearances, settling estates, protecting reputations, and pretending that blood has never been used as a weapon. At first glance, the DNA report looked like an administrative detail, the kind of thing a careful woman like Lily would review, question, and resolve before the end of the day. She had every reason to expect a minor clerical mistake, some old file misread, some outdated information attached to the wrong record. But the feeling that settled over her was not irritation. It was dread. Something in the structure of the report felt wrong in a way she could not immediately explain. The names lined up too precisely. The dates carried an ugly kind of intent. And when Malcolm's name appeared in connection with a branch of family history that had long been treated as settled, the room around Lily seemed to lose its balance. She had lived too long among secrets not to recognize when one had been buried with purpose. This was not an error. Errors are messy, accidental, visible once light touches them. This had been arranged, curated, protected. Someone had reached into the heart of the Winters family years ago and altered something so intimate, so foundational, that the lie had been allowed to harden into legacy. The horror of that discovery did not come from one explosive realization. It came in stages, each more punishing than the last. Lily began where she always began, with control. She reviewed documents, traced dates, checked chains of custody, studied signatures, and forced herself to approach the matter as if discipline alone could shield her from the emotional ruin waiting underneath. But the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that the report in her hand was only the loose thread of a larger design. Old records had been amended. Medical notes had disappeared. One sample number had been reassigned years earlier in a way that should have triggered scrutiny, yet somehow never had. What should have been impossible had been made to look procedural. The mechanism of the deception was almost as terrifying as its purpose, because it meant this was not a moment of weakness or panic. It was a long-term strategy. Someone had not merely told a lie. Someone had built an architecture around it. And once Lily understood that, her fear changed shape. She stopped asking whether the family had been misled. She began asking who had benefited from the lie staying alive for so long. Every possible answer led her toward betrayal, toward ambition, toward emotional cowardice disguised as protection. It was the kind of betrayal only a trusted person could successfully sustain, because only a trusted person would know how to twist love into silence and silence into loyalty. Devon felt the shift before he understood the cause. That was the cruelest part. Truth does not always announce itself with facts. Sometimes it arrives first through atmosphere, through altered glances, and the strange weight of conversations that stop too abruptly when you enter a room. Devon had spent enough of his life navigating complicated family terrain to recognize the sensation of standing near a hidden fault line. He could feel people studying him with concern they were trying to conceal, and concern of that kind was never innocent. It carried pity. It carried fear. It carried the possibility that his own identity, his place in the family, and the emotional map by which he had lived his life were all being examined by others before he had even been told there was something to examine. That offended something deep in him. Devon could survive pain. He could survive conflict. What he had never tolerated well was manipulation, especially when it came wrapped in the language of family protection. The moment he sensed that something fundamental was being handled around him rather than with him, anger began to rise. Not the kind that burns fast and burns out, but the slow, dangerous kind that comes from humiliation. He started looking backward, reevaluating old tensions, old hesitations, old moments when someone had changed the subject or insisted the past was too messy to reopen. What once seemed like family fatigue now looked more like coordination. And the more he noticed, the more his anger became personal. If his life had been shaped by a falsehood, then every choice made on the basis of that falsehood had been stolen from him. Every bond, every grief, every reconciliation had existed under a shadow he was never permitted to see. Lily hated that part most of all. The way the truth threatened not only to damage the present but to contaminate memory itself. She could withstand scandal. She could withstand rage. But this was different. This was the possibility that her family's emotional history had been edited, that people she loved had made life-altering decisions while standing on compromised ground. That thought hollowed her out. It also sharpened her. Lily had spent years rebuilding herself through disappointment, heartbreak, and responsibility. She knew what it meant to hold a family together when other people were too wounded or too selfish to do it. So when she realized that a lie of this scale had been maintained while she was trying to preserve some version of order, it felt like a personal violation. It was not simply that someone had deceived the family. It was that someone had used the family's trust, their trauma, their instinct to protect one another, as camouflage. Lily began to understand that whoever engineered this knew exactly what kind of emotional pressure points to exploit. They understood that the Winters family, for all its strength, also carried old vulnerabilities, fear of abandonment, guilt over past fractures, the desperate desire not to reopen wounds that had cost too much to survive the first time. That knowledge narrowed the field. This could not have been done by an outsider with a grudge alone. The mastermind had to be someone close enough to know which truth would do the most damage and which silence would keep everyone compliant. As Lily pieced together the timeline, Malcolm's presence loomed like a ghost over every new discovery. His name did not merely complicate the records. It inflamed every unresolved ache that had ever existed inside the family. Malcolm had always represented more than one thing at once. He was history, love, resentment, possibility, and unfinished business all bound together in one name. To see that name embedded in altered DNA documentation was to feel the past weaponized. Lily could almost hear the emotional aftershocks before they came. She knew what this would do to old loyalties, to buried rivalries, to the family members who had already spent years trying to make peace with difficult truths. If Malcolm had been knowingly or unknowingly positioned at the center of this deception, then the consequences would extend far beyond paternity. The lie would infect everything around it. It would change how people understood sacrifices that had once seemed noble, decisions that had once seemed tragic but necessary, and grudges that had once looked petty but might now make terrible sense. Even worse, Lily could not yet tell whether Malcolm himself had been used, shielded, or implicated. That uncertainty was unbearable. It meant that every step toward the truth threatened to destroy someone in a different way. There was no clean outcome anymore, only varying degrees of devastation. Devon's reaction intensified when pieces of the story began reaching him in fragments instead of honesty. Nothing enrages a man faster than learning that others believe he is too fragile, too volatile, or too peripheral to deserve the full truth about his own life. The partial disclosures were almost worse than silence. They insulted his intelligence while demanding his emotional obedience. Devon responded the way wounded pride often responds, with aggression, suspicion, and a refusal to be handled. He pushed harder, asked sharper questions, and started testing people with a coldness that unsettled everyone around him. The warmth that had once made others lean toward him vanished behind a controlled, cutting stare. He began to feel cornered not just by the secret, but by the possibility that members of his own family had looked at him over the years and seen a man living inside a narrative they knew was incomplete. That thought stripped away his patience. His anger was no longer limited to the unknown architect of the lie. It expanded toward anyone who had suspected, anyone who had rationalized, anyone who had decided that preserving peace mattered more than respecting his right to know. He started to interpret restraint as guilt and compassion as condescension. In that mindset, even love became hard to trust. Devon did not want soothing. He wanted accountability. He wanted names. He wanted to know who had touched the foundation of his life and why they thought they would never have to answer for it. The breakthrough came not from a dramatic confession, but from a pattern, which made it more chilling. Lily noticed that one name kept surfacing at the edges of altered records, deleted access trails, and conveniently missing verification notes. It was not a name she expected. That was precisely why it shattered her. The closer she moved to certainty, the more violently her heart rejected the conclusion. This was someone she had trusted not casually but deeply. Someone whose presence in her life had been associated with steadiness, protection, maybe even sacrifice. That was the final cruelty. The person behind the deception had not merely betrayed the family in a practical sense. They had corrupted the emotional safety that trust is supposed to provide. Lily could have endured an enemy. She did not know how to endure this. Once the possibility settled into her bones, she began replaying years of interactions through a new lens. Kindness began to look strategic. Silence began to look calculated. Concern began to look like management. She realized with sickening clarity that what she had once interpreted as compassion may at times have been containment. Whoever had done this had not only hidden the truth, they had stayed close enough to monitor the damage, shape the narrative, and step in whenever the past threatened to breathe again. That realization did something dangerous to Lily. It hardened her grief into fury, and yet fury was not enough to simplify the decision before her. That is what made the situation so brutal. Lily was not standing at the edge of a moral choice between right and wrong. She was standing between two forms of destruction. If she exposed everything, the family would be forced to confront a lie so profound that it could poison every relationship touched by it. Devon's sense of identity could fracture. Long-standing bonds could break under the weight of retrospective betrayal. Resentments buried years ago could erupt with fresh legitimacy. The person responsible would be exposed, but exposure would not heal anything. It would only remove the final barrier between the family and the full blast of the truth. On the other hand, if Lily kept silent, she would become complicit in the same moral cowardice that had disgusted her from the beginning. She would be choosing stability over honesty, appearance over dignity, inherited damage over immediate collapse. That choice might preserve the family's outward structure for a little while longer, but it would rot her from the inside. She would know that every family dinner, every reconciliation, every gesture of love was still taking place over a grave no one had properly marked. The silence would not protect them. It would simply postpone the explosion until it became even more lethal. The emotional pressure started changing everyone around her. Devon grew harsher, more volatile, less willing to interpret anyone generously. That volatility began to trigger reactions in others, who in turn became defensive, evasive, or openly accusatory. The family ceased to feel like a family and started to resemble a battlefield disguised as a living room. Every conversation had two layers: what was being said and what everyone feared was about to be said. Lily watched the tension spread and understood that secrets do not merely hide in a family. They recruit. They make liars of the frightened, cowards of the loyal, and enemies of the wounded. The more she hesitated, the more the lie itself seemed to take on a life of its own, shaping behavior without needing to be spoken. Devon's anger made him reckless. Other relatives, sensing disaster, began making private moves of their own, checking records, contacting old sources, protecting themselves before the truth could choose its victims. In a twisted way, the deception was still doing exactly what it had always done, isolating people from one another while convincing each of them that their silence was somehow necessary. Lily saw it happening in real time and hated herself for becoming part of the mechanism. But she also saw the fragility underneath the anger. Devon was not merely furious. He was wounded in that deepest possible way, the way only family can wound, because family shapes the original story by which a person knows who they are. If that story can be tampered with, then nothing feels safe. Not memory, not loyalty, not even love. By the time Lily confronted the full reality of what had been done, her anger had become inseparable from grief. She was grieving the version of her family she thought had existed. She was grieving the years lost to a fiction so carefully preserved that it had become part of their emotional inheritance. She was grieving the possibility that some relationships would never recover, because certain truths do not cleanse, they stain. Yet alongside that grief was a colder instinct, one that had carried her through every collapse before this one. She knew that the lie had survived because too many people had convinced themselves that timing mattered more than honesty. There was always a reason to wait, always a crisis that made disclosure inconvenient, always a vulnerable person who supposedly needed protecting. That was how moral failure dressed itself in respectable clothing. Lily refused to let that happen again, but the refusal came at a cost. To move forward, she would have to stop thinking like a daughter, a sister, a guardian of family peace. She would have to think like a witness to a crime done in the language of love. And that shift was devastating because it meant surrendering the last comforting illusion that intentions mattered more than consequences. What made the final stretch unbearable was the knowledge that once the truth entered the room, it could not be controlled. Lily had spent days trying to imagine a version of revelation that was measured, careful, survivable. None existed. There was no elegant way to tell a family that part of its history had been rewritten by one of its own. There was no gentle way to explain that identity itself had been managed, redirected, perhaps exploited for reasons tied to ego, guilt, inheritance, or emotional possession. The motives, once understood, were as ugly as the act. This had not been done out of simple malice. In some ways, that made it worse. It had been done because someone believed they had the right to engineer outcomes, to decide whose truth mattered, whose pain was acceptable, whose future could be altered for the sake of preserving a chosen version of the family. That kind of arrogance is always dangerous, because it hides behind certainty. The architect of the lie had likely told themselves for years that they were preventing chaos. In reality, they had been manufacturing a delayed catastrophe, and now Lily was the one forced to choose when the blast would occur. In the end, the decision before her became less about revelation and more about what kind of woman she could still bear to be after this. She could continue the cycle, become another keeper of the lie, another person who looked into Devon's eyes and measured his right to know against everyone else's fear of the consequences. Or, she could destroy the last illusion of safety and trust that still held the family together, knowing that some people would never forgive her for lighting the match even if she had not built the bomb. That was the real torment of it. Truth often punishes the messenger when the messenger arrives too late. Lily understood that if she spoke, she might become the face of the disaster rather than the person who tried to end it. Devon's anger might not spare her. The family, desperate for order, might cling to resentment rather than accountability. The guilty might even attempt to cast themselves as victims of her timing. But silence would be worse. Silence would mean accepting that love in this family was allowed to coexist with manipulation so long as the photographs still looked intact. So Lily stood at the center of a collapse that had been years in the making, carrying a truth sharp enough to split generations. Around her, the emotional temperature kept rising. Devon's identity hung in the balance. Malcolm's name hovered over the family like a storm cloud, thick with unfinished history. Trust was already bleeding out, even before the full story had been spoken aloud. And somewhere beneath all the pain was the ugliest realization of all. The Winters family was not only facing the exposure of one buried deception, it was being forced to confront the possibility that the people they loved most were capable of turning love into control, protection into possession, and family into the most dangerous battlefield of all. In Genoa City, that kind of revelation never ends with one confession or one shattered relationship. It changes how every person in the room will look at one another from that moment on. It leaves behind a silence that is no longer peaceful, only stunned. And once that silence falls, no one emerges unchanged.